In the heart of Willow Creek, a quaint Oregon town nestled among rolling hills and whispering pines, the community center glowed with warm light on a crisp autumn evening. The occasion was David Miller's retirement gala, a grand affair to honor his return to teaching at the local college after a brief retirement. The room buzzed with laughter, clinking glasses, and the hum of admiration for the esteemed professor. Former students, colleagues, and townsfolk filled the hall, their faces alight with pride for the man who had shaped so many minds. At the center of it all stood David, his silver hair neatly combed, his suit crisp, exuding the charm that had made him a beloved figure for decades. But the night was anything but celebratory for Emily Miller, his wife of over 40 years. Emily stood near the edge of the banquet hall, her hands clasped tightly in front of her faded floral dress, feeling like a stranger in her own life. She hadn't been invited, not officially. No one had sent her an engraved invitation or whispered about the event in her presence. Yet here she was, drawn by a nagging instinct, a quiet pull in her gut that told her she needed to see this for herself. The air was thick with the scent of roasted chicken and roses, the tables adorned with white linens and flickering candles. The room was alive and vibrant, but Emily felt a chill that no amount of warmth could dispel. As she lingered near a column half hidden in the shadows, the crowd parted and a hush fell over the room. The master of ceremonies, a former student named Tom, stepped forward with a grin. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice booming through the microphone, "we've prepared a special surprise for Professor Miller tonight." The audience leaned forward, their anticipation palpable. Emily's heart thudded, though she couldn't place why. Then a woman emerged from behind a decorative screen, an elegant older woman named Laura Bennett. Laura was striking even in her late 60s. Her tailored navy dress hugged her slender frame, and her silver hair was swept into a graceful bun, accentuating the fine lines of wisdom on her face. Her presence commanded attention not through flashiness, but through a quiet dignity that seemed to draw every eye. David's face changed the moment he saw her. His usual composure faltered, his lips parting, as his eyes glistened with unshed tears. He crossed the room in a few quick strides, his hands reaching for hers. "Laura," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "if Emily hadn't saved me from drowning back then, you wouldn't have had to leave. We wouldn't have lost all these years." The words hit Emily like a physical blow, each syllable slicing through the fragile armor she'd built over decades. Laura's eyes mirrored David's, brimming with tears as she squeezed his hands. "David," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I've thought of you every day." The room erupted in soft gasps and murmurs of approval, as if this reunion were the climax of a long-awaited love story. Emily's gaze darted to her children, Michael, her son, and his wife Clara, and her grandson Ethan, who stood among the crowd. They surged forward, embracing Laura and calling her Aunt Laura, with warmth that should have been reserved for Emily. Michael's eyes shone with pride. Clara's smile was wide, and Ethan, barely 17, hugged Laura as if she were family. To them, Laura was a queen, a figure from David's past they'd heard of in hushed, reverent tones. To Emily, she was a ghost who had haunted her marriage for decades. Emily's chest tightened, a strange numbness spreading through her. She felt like an uninvited guest at her husband's celebration, a shadow in a room full of light. David had once told her in a moment of drunken cruelty that it was a mistake for her to save him from that river all those years ago. He'd said it with venom, as if her bravery had ruined his life. Now, watching him cling to Laura's hands, his face alight with a love Emily had never seen directed at her, she understood the depth of his regret. But the truth was, she regretted it too. She regretted diving into that icy river, risking her life for a man who would never love her back. She regretted the years she'd spent pouring her heart into a marriage that had left her hollow. Emily's eyes stung as the crowd cheered, but she refused to cry. She'd shed enough tears for David Miller. Instead, she forced a small, brittle smile, her hands trembling at her sides. A young woman approached, one of David's former students, her face bright with excitement. "Mrs. Miller, isn't this just the most beautiful moment?" she gushed, oblivious to Emily's pain. "It's like something out of a movie. If you're as moved as I am, you should share your thoughts in the comments below. Maybe even hit that like button to spread the love for Professor Miller's story. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt reunions like this one." Her enthusiasm was infectious to the crowd. But to Emily, it was a cruel reminder of her invisibility. She nodded faintly, her throat too tight to respond, and turned away, her steps slow and deliberate as she moved toward the exit. The gala continued behind her, celebrating a love that had never included her, and Emily knew she could no longer stay in its shadow. Emily stepped into the cool night air outside the Willow Creek Community Center, the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses fading behind her. The stars above were sharp and clear, a stark contrast to the fog in her heart. She wrapped her arms around herself, her worn cardigan offering little warmth against the autumn chill. She hadn't meant to come to David's gala, not really. It was a whisper from a neighbor, a chance mention of the big surprise for Professor Miller that had drawn her here. No one had invited her, not her husband's son Michael or even her grandson Ethan, who idolized David. She was an afterthought, a footnote in the story of David Miller's life, and the weight of that truth pressed down on her like a stone. As she stood by the parking lot, her breath visible in the crisp air, a familiar voice broke through her thoughts. "Mrs. Miller, you're just getting here." It was Sarah, one of David's former students, her face a mix of surprise and concern. Sarah's curly hair bounced as she tilted her head, her eyes scanning Emily as if trying to place her in this moment. Emily forced a smile, her lips tight. Just passing by, she lied, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah didn't press, but her expression softened as if she sensed something was wrong. She said, "You're in for a treat," gesturing toward the hall. "They're about to reveal the big surprise for Professor Miller. Come on, let's get you inside." Emily hesitated, but followed Sarah, her steps heavy with dread. The server at the entrance barely glanced at her as he swung open the banquet hall doors, revealing a scene that twisted the knife in her chest. David sat at the head table, surrounded by his proudest students, middle-aged men and women who had gone on to become doctors, lawyers, and teachers, all thanks to his guidance. Their faces glowed with admiration, their laughter filling the air. In his element, David leaned back in his chair, his smile wide and confident, the picture of a man who had conquered life. Emily's eyes lingered on him, searching for the man she'd married, the one she'd loved, despite his coldness. She found only a stranger. One of the students, a man with salt and pepper hair, stood and raised his wine glass. "To Professor Miller," he said, his voice carrying a knowing smile, "for your retirement and triumphant return to teaching. We've got something special for you tonight." The others at the table exchanged glances, their excitement barely contained. Flourishingly, they slid aside a decorative folding screen revealing Laura Bennett. She stood poised and graceful, her navy dress catching the light, her silver hair framing a face that still held the beauty of her youth. The crowd gasped, then erupted in applause. David's eyes reddened instantly, his chair scraping back as he stood. "Laura," he said, his voice breaking, "it's really you." Laura Bennett was David's first love, the woman who had lived in his heart for decades, a name whispered in moments of anger or nostalgia. Even his students knew her as his white moonlight, the untouchable ideal Emily could never match. Laura's eyes filled with tears as she stepped forward, her hands trembling as they met David's. "David," she said softly, "if Emily hadn't jumped into that river to save you, you wouldn't have left me. We wouldn't have been forced apart." David nodded, his voice thick with regret. "And I wouldn't have had to marry her," he added, the words cutting through the air like a blade. The room seemed to hold its breath, the students' cheers faltering momentarily before resuming with renewed vigor. Emily's son Michael and grandson Ethan joined the crowd around David and Laura, their faces alight with joy. They called Laura Aunt Laura, their voices warm and familiar, as if she were part of their family. Emily stood frozen, her heart pounding in her ears. She was the uninvited guest, the woman who had given everything, her youth, her health, her love, to a man who saw her as a mistake. Sarah, standing beside her, shifted awkwardly, sensing the tension. I didn't know you weren't invited," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Emily didn't respond. She gave a slight brittle smile, turned on her heel, and walked back into the night. As she stepped outside, the weight of 40 years crashed over her. She remembered the day she saved David from the river, a young volunteer teacher who had slipped into the icy waters during a community project. She'd jumped in without hesitation, pulling him to safety, only to be bound to him by gossip and obligation. Their marriage had been cold, David's heart always elsewhere, his resentment a constant shadow. She'd supported him through college, graduate school, and his rise to a respected professor, all while her spirit withered. Her health had deteriorated, her body worn from years of housework and neglect. Even Michael and Ethan had looked at her with contempt, as if she were unworthy of their brilliant father and grandfather. And now they had orchestrated this reunion, choosing Laura over her, their own mother and grandmother. Emily's steps faltered as she reached the edge of the parking lot, her vision blurring with unshed tears. She thought of David's words spoken years ago in a drunken rage. "You shouldn't have saved me, Emily. You ruined everything." Now watching him with Laura surrounded by her family's adoration, she felt the truth of his words. But she regretted it too, not for his sake, but for her own. She regretted giving her life to a man who had never wanted her to a family, who had turned their backs on her as she stood alone in the darkness. The stars above seemed to mock her, their light cold and distant, like the love she had chased for so long. The night air of Willow Creek clung to Emily Miller as she walked away from the community center, her steps heavy with the weight of betrayal. The gala's warm glow faded behind her, but the image of David clasping Laura Bennett's hands, his eyes alight with a love Emily had never known, burned in her mind. She crossed the quiet streets of the small Oregon town where lamplights cast long shadows, and the distant rush of the Willow River whispered memories of a life she could not escape. 40 years ago, that river had changed everything, binding her to a man who saw her as a burden, a mistake that had cost him his true love. As Emily trudged toward her modest home, the past unfurled like a worn tapestry, each thread reminding her of the sacrifices she'd made for a loveless marriage. In the summer of 1975, Emily, a spirited young woman of 20, saved David Miller from the Willow River. He was a volunteer teacher, part of a community project to rebuild the town's schoolhouse after a fire. The river, swollen from spring rains, had caught David off guard as he waded in to retrieve a dropped tool. His panicked flailing drew Emily's attention as she passed by her arms full of wildflowers she'd picked for her mother. Without hesitation, she dropped the flowers and plunged into the icy current, her strong arms pulling him to the muddy bank. The townsfolk who saw her heroism spread the tale, their whispers turning to gossip. The story grew in a small town like Willow Creek, where everyone knew everyone's business. Emily had saved David, touched him in the water, and now their reputations were entwined. David came to her family's farmhouse a week later, his face grim as he proposed. Emily's parents, worried about her honor and impressed by David's acceptance to a prestigious northern university, urged her to accept. She did, hoping love would grow. But David was never warm, cruel, just cold like the river that had brought them together. He kept his distance, his eyes looking past her as if searching for someone else. Emily learned later, through a drunken outburst, that someone else was Laura Bennett, another volunteer teacher he'd loved. "You spread those rumors," he'd slurred one night, pointing a trembling finger at her, "and forced me to marry you. Laura left because of you, Emily. You ruined my life." The accusation cut deep, mainly because Emily hadn't spread the rumors. They'd sprouted from the townsfolk's eager tongues, fueled by her act of bravery. But she was pregnant with their son, Michael, by then, her belly swelling under her apron. What could she do? She swallowed her pain and vowed to make it work. She supported David through college, working long hours at the local diner to pay his tuition while he studied. She took on extra shifts when he pursued graduate school, her hands rough from scrubbing dishes. She cared for his ailing mother, a sharp-tongued woman who never thanked her even as Emily bathed her and changed her linens. David's career soared. He became a respected professor at Willow Creek College, admired by students who hung on his every word. Meanwhile, Emily's health crumbled. Her back ached from years of labor, her once vibrant eyes dulled by exhaustion. She was a ghost in her home, invisible to the man she'd given everything for. Worse still was the contempt from her own family. Michael, their son, grew up idolizing David, his brilliant father who could do no wrong. He'd roll his eyes when Emily spoke, dismissing her as uneducated, unworthy of a man so refined. Ethan, her teenage grandson, was no better. He'd scoff at her worn dresses, her calloused hands, as if she were an embarrassment. Emily had poured her love into them, cooking their favorite meals, sewing their clothes, but they saw her as less than Laura, the elegant woman from David's stories. With her city polish and gentle voice, Laura was the ideal they measured Emily against, and she always fell short. As Emily neared her house, the porch light flickering in the darkness, she paused, her hand on the gate. The memory of David's words at the gala. "If Emily hadn't saved me, we wouldn't have lost all these years," echoed in her ears. She'd always known he resented her, but to hear it so publicly in front of their family and his students was a wound that bled anew. She thought of the years she'd spent trying to earn his love, the nights she'd cried herself to sleep, the days she'd pushed through pain to keep their family afloat. And for what? To be cast aside at a celebration she wasn't even invited to watch her husband and family embrace another woman, as if she were the one who belonged. Emily's fingers tightened on the gate, her knuckles white. She regretted saving David not because it had cost him Laura, but because it had cost her everything, her youth, joy, and chance at a life with someone who might have loved her back. Emily pushed open the gate to her Willow Creek home, and the creak of the hinges was a familiar sound on the quiet night. The modest two-story house with peeling paint and a sagging porch was a testament to her years of toil. Inside the living room was dark, the only light coming from a lamp in the corner where she'd left it on, expecting to return from the gala with David. But David wasn't coming home, not tonight, maybe not ever. The realization settled over her like a heavy fog, and she sank into the worn armchair, her hands trembling as she replayed the events at the community center. The image of Laura Bennett, elegant and poised, surrounded by Emily's family, gnawed at her heart. It wasn't just David's betrayal that stung, it was the complicity of her son Michael and her grandson Ethan, who had orchestrated this cruel reunion. A month ago, Emily had noticed Ethan hunched over his phone, his eyes wide with excitement. "Grandma, look at this," he'd said, thrusting the screen toward David. While stirring soup in the kitchen, Emily had caught a glimpse of a woman in a tailored dress, her silver hair in a bun, writing calligraphy with graceful strokes. "Doesn't she look like the lady in Grandpa's old photo?" Ethan had asked, his voice brimming with awe. David had slipped on his reading glasses, his face paling as he stared at the screen. "That's Laura," he'd whispered almost to himself. Emily had pretended not to hear, but the name pierced her like a needle. Laura Bennett. David's first love, the woman who had haunted their marriage like a specter. She was no longer a distant memory, but a living, breathing presence revived through the internet's vast reach. Through snippets of overheard conversations, Emily learned later that Ethan had found Laura on a social media platform where she posted videos of her calligraphy and poetry readings. Now a widowed, retired teacher, Laura had gained a small following for her elegance and wisdom. To Ethan, a 17-year-old enamored with his grandfather's stories. Laura was a revelation, a cultured, refined woman who seemed the perfect match for David's brilliance. Michael, Emily's son, shared Ethan's admiration. He'd grown up hearing David's wistful tales of Laura, the volunteer teacher, who had left Willow Creek after David married Emily. To Michael, Laura was the mother he wished he'd had, not the worn-out woman who cooked his meals and mended his clothes. Michael and Ethan had schemed to bring Laura to the gala, contacting her through social media and arranging her surprise appearance. They'd kept it secret from Emily, knowing she'd never approve. At the gala, Emily had seen the truth in their actions. Standing beside Laura, Michael had beamed with pride as he introduced her to the crowd. Ethan had hugged her, calling her Aunt Laura with a warmth he'd never shown Emily. Their betrayal was a knife in her gut, sharper than David's words. They hadn't just excluded her, they'd replaced her, choosing a stranger over the woman who had raised them. As Emily sat in the armchair, her fingers tracing the frayed fabric, she remembered Michael's face when he'd spotted her at the gala. His eyes had widened in panic, his mouth opening as if to speak, then closing as he turned away, pretending not to see her. He feared she'd ruin their perfect moment, their carefully staged reunion of David and his lost love. The thought made Emily's chest ache, a mix of anger and sorrow that threatened to choke her. She rose and walked to the kitchen where a photo of her family, David, Michael, Clara, and Ethan, hung on the wall, smiling at a picnic years ago. Emily was in the background, blurred, holding a tray of sandwiches. Even in their memories, she was invisible. She thought of the years she'd spent trying to win their love, cooking Michael's favorite apple pie, sewing Ethan's baseball uniform, only to be met with indifference or scorn. They saw her as less than Laura, whose elegance they worshipped, whose absence they romanticized. Emily's health had suffered for it, her back stooped from years of labor, her hands rough from washing dishes and scrubbing floors. She looked older than her 65 years, while David, her age, carried himself with the vitality of a man who had never borne the weight of their marriage. The realization that her family had orchestrated this betrayal cut deeper than David's coldness. They had chosen Laura, a woman they barely knew, over the mother and grandmother, who had given everything for them. Emily's eyes stung, but she blinked back the tears. She'd cried enough for David, for Michael, for Ethan. She thought of the river again, that fateful day when she'd saved David, tying her life to his. He'd blamed her for ruining his chance with Laura, but now she saw the truth: saving him had ruined her. She regretted diving into that river, not for his sake, but for her own, for the life she might have had, for the love she might have found with someone who saw her worth. As the clock ticked in the quiet house, Emily's resolve hardened. She couldn't change the past, but she could face the truth her family's deception had left her alone, and she deserved better than their shadows. Emily Miller's footsteps echoed in the empty streets of Willow Creek, the cold Oregon night wrapping around her like a shroud. The community center's lights had faded behind her, but the sting of David's reunion with Laura Bennett and her own family's betrayal pulsed in her chest. She walked unthinkingly, her mind a storm of memories: David's coldness, Michael's disdain, Ethan's worship of a woman who wasn't her. The Willow River's distant rush called her a cruel reminder of the day she'd saved David, tying her life to his resentment. Her worn shoes caught on a loose cobblestone as she crossed the town square. Her ankle twisted, and she stumbled, her hands flailing for balance. The world tilted, and she fell toward the hard ground, a scream trapped in her throat. Darkness swallowed her, but it wasn't the end. Soft yet resonant voice echoed in the void. "Rado your choice, Emily. Make it right." It was neither male nor female, human nor divine, but it carried a weight that pierced her soul. Her eyes snapped open, and she gasped, the air sharp and warm. She was no longer in the town square, but on a familiar dirt path, the summer sun blazing overhead. The scent of wildflowers and river water filled her lungs, and she looked down at her hands, calloused but young, her skin smooth, unmarred by decades of toil. Her dress, a simple cotton shift, fluttered in the breeze, and her heart raced as she recognized the scene. It was 1975, the day David Miller fell into the Willow River. Emily stood frozen, her breath shallow. The voice's words echoed, "Rado your choice." This was no dream, a second chance, a gift from some unseen force to rewrite her life. Shouts broke through her daze, urgent and familiar. "Help, David's in the river. He can't swim." The cries came from the riverbank, where townsfolk and volunteers gathered, their voices laced with panic. Emily's legs twitched, her old instincts urging her to run toward the water and dive in like before. But the memory of David's words at the gala, "If Emily hadn't saved me, we wouldn't have lost all these years," stopped her cold. She saw Laura's tearful face, Michael and Ethan's betrayal, and the decades of loneliness that followed her act of bravery. No, this time she wouldn't save him. She remembered that the river was shallow where David had fallen. Someone else would pull him out, someone else could bear the weight of his resentment. Her heart pounded with a new purpose, a memory sharper than the cries by the river. James Carter, the boy she'd loved since childhood, was in danger today, too. In her past life, he'd been crushed by a falling tree in the forest behind Willow Creek, his legs ruined, his dreams shattered. She'd learned of his fate too late from his niece, years after he'd vanished from her life. If she could save him instead, she could change everything, not just for him, but for herself. Emily turned from the river, her feet pounding the dirt path as she ran toward the forest. The summer heat pressed against her, sweat beading her forehead, but she didn't slow. The forest loomed ahead, a tangle of pines and oaks, their shadows cool and dark. She called James's name, her voice raw with desperation. "James, where are you?" The trees swallowed her words, but she pushed forward, branches snagging her dress. Her ankle throbbed from her earlier stumble, but she ignored the pain driven by knowing what was at stake. James was chopping wood somewhere in these woods, unaware of the rotted tree that would fall and steal his future. A distant thud, like an axe striking wood, reached her ears. She veered toward it, her heart leaping. Through a thicket, she saw him, James Carter, shirtless and sweating, his broad shoulders tense as he swung an axe into a massive oak. His dark hair fell into his eyes, and his face, weathered by years of hardship, held a quiet determination. "James!" she shouted, her voice breaking. He turned, surprise flashing across his features, the axe pausing mid-swing. "Emily, what are you doing here?" Before she could answer, a loud crack split the air. The tree above him swayed, its rotted core giving way. "Watch out!" Emily screamed, lunging forward. She tackled James, her momentum knocking them both to the ground. They rolled through the dirt branches, snapping around them as the tree crashed down with a thunderous boom, missing them by inches. Dust clouded the air and birds scattered from the canopy. Emily lay panting, her body pressed against James's, her hands clutching his arms. "Are you okay?" she gasped, her eyes scanning his legs, terrified they might be trapped. James, stunned, nodded slowly, his breath ragged. "I'm fine, Emily. You saved me." Tears welled in her eyes, not from fear, but from relief. She'd done it, she'd changed his fate. James sat up, his hands gentle as he checked her for injuries. "You're hurt," he said, noticing the scratches on her arms from the branches. What were you thinking running out here like that? Emily shook her head, her voice trembling. I had a dream, James. I saw the tree falling, crushing you. I couldn't let it happen. It was a half-truth she couldn't tell him about the voice, the second chance, not yet. James's eyes softened, a flicker of something deeper passing between them. He helped her to her feet, his touch steady, and Emily felt seen for the first time in years. Emily sat on a fallen log in the Willow Creek forest, her ankle throbbing from her sprint and tumble. James Carter crouched beside her, his calloused hands brushing dirt from her scratched arms. The summer sun filtered through the pines, casting dappled light on his face, which was etched with concern. The crashed tree lay nearby, a jagged reminder of the fate she'd averted. Emily's heart still raced, not just from the near miss, but from being so close to James, the boy she'd loved since they were children, the one she'd lost in her past life because of her choice to save David. As James tore a strip from his shirt to wrap her scratches, Emily's mind drifted to the years they'd shared and the pain of his disappearance that had haunted her for decades. She and James had grown up together in Willow Creek, and they were classmates from elementary school through ninth grade. He was a foundling adopted by old Mr. Carter, the town's librarian, who raised him with quiet kindness. James was bright, always scribbling in notebooks, dreaming of becoming a scientist. Emily loved his shy smile, the way he'd ruffle her hair when she teased him, and his eyes lit up when he talked about the stars. They'd sit by the riverbank after school, she reading poetry while he sketched constellations, their laughter blending with the water's murmur. But in ninth grade, Mr. Carter fell ill, and James dropped out to work odd jobs chopping wood, fixing fences to pay for his treatment. When Mr. Carter died, James left town, returning only months ago for the funeral. Emily had planned to confess her feelings, then her heart pounding as she'd walk to his small cabin. But that was the day she'd saved David from the river, setting off the chain of gossip that led to her marriage. When she finally went to find James, his cabin was empty. The townsfolk whispered he'd left with a wealthy woman, a rumor that broke Emily's heart. She'd married David pregnant and bound by obligation, but never stopped wondering about James. In her past life, decades later, she'd met his niece Rachel, who revealed the truth: James hadn't left with a lover. He'd been crushed by a falling tree that same day his legs ruined. His sister, a city lawyer, had taken him away, and he'd hidden his injury, believing himself unworthy of Emily. He'd asked his family to keep it secret, hoping she'd forget him. Now, sitting in the forest, Emily looked at James, his face unmarred by the tragedy she'd prevented. "You scared me half to death," he said, tying the makeshift bandage around her arm. "How'd you know that tree was gonna fall?" Emily hesitated, her mind racing for an explanation. It was a feeling, she said, her voice soft, like I'd lived this day before and knew what was coming. James raised an eyebrow but didn't press, his focus shifting to her swollen ankle. He said, "We need to get you to the clinic," turning to offer his back. "Hop on. I'll carry you." Emily wrapped her arms around his neck, her cheek against his shoulder as he carried her through the forest. His warmth, the steady rhythm of his steps, stirred memories of their childhood days spent chasing fireflies, sharing secrets under the stars. She'd loved him even then, though she hadn't known how to name it. "James," she said quietly, "why were you out here chopping wood?" He was silent for a moment, his ears reddening. "I need money," he admitted. "Used everything I had for Dad's funeral. I want to go back to school, Emily. Take the college entrance exam. Be someone you'd be proud of." Her heart swelled, tears pricking her eyes. James had done just that in her past life, self-studying for the exam, earning a PhD, and becoming a renowned scientist despite his injury. But he'd done it alone, believing she'd moved on. She said, "You've always been someone I'm proud of," tightening her arms around him. "You don't need a degree for that." James chuckled, a shy, boyish sound that made her chest ache. "Your dad says otherwise," he said. "Says you deserve a college man." Emily's father, a prosperous farmer, had modernized his views after the college entrance exams were reinstated, insisting she marry a graduate. James had heard those words, and they'd driven him to work harder, to dream bigger. As they reached the edge of the forest, the town clinic came into view, a small brick building by the river. James carried her inside, calling for the doctor. On a treatment bed, Emily saw David soaked and pale, his chest bruised from his rescuer's efforts. His eyes met hers, filled with a wounded reproach, as if blaming her for not saving him. She looked away, her heart steady. This time David was someone else's burden. James set her down gently, his hands lingering on her arms. He said, "You're going to be okay," his voice soft but firm. Emily nodded, meeting his gaze. She felt a spark of hope for the first time in this new life. She'd saved James from the tree and the loneliness that had consumed them both. Whatever this second chance was, she wouldn't let it slip away. The summer sun beat down on the Willow Creek forest, its golden rays slicing through the dense canopy of pines and oaks. Emily Miller lay sprawled in the dirt, her breath ragged, her arms still wrapped around James Carter from the desperate tackle that had saved him from a falling tree. The massive oak, its rotted core exposed, lay in a jagged heap beside them, dust settling like a veil over the scene. Emily's heart pounded, not just from the near miss, but from the weight of what she'd done changed the course of James's life and perhaps her own. Her ankle throbbed, twisted during her frantic sprint through the woods, and scratches stung her arms where branches had clawed her skin. But as she looked at James, his dark eyes wide with shock and gratitude, she felt a surge of hope she hadn't known in decades. James sat up, his bare chest heaving, sweat glistening on his skin from the morning's labor. "Emily, you're crazy," he said, his voice a mix of awe and concern. "You could have been killed." He reached for her, his calloused hands gentle as he checked her for injuries. "Your arms are all scratched up, and your ankle, can you stand?" Emily shook her head, wincing as she tried to move. "I had to come," she said, her voice trembling. I saw it, James, in a dream. The tree is falling, crushing you. I couldn't let it happen." It was the closest she could come to explaining the truth, the mysterious voice that had sent her back to 1975, the second chance to rewrite her life. James's brow furrowed, but he didn't question her. Instead, he tore another strip from his already tattered shirt and wrapped her scratched arms with care, his fingers steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through him. "You're something else, Emily Miller," he said, a shy smile breaking through his worry. The smile took her back to their childhood, to lazy afternoons by the Willow River, when they'd skip stones and dream of futures that seemed so far away. She'd loved him even then, though she'd been too young to name it. Now, with the weight of her past life pressing against her, she knew she couldn't lose him again. "James said we need to get you to the clinic," standing and offering his back. "Hop on. I'm not letting you walk on that ankle." Emily hesitated, then wrapped her arms around his neck, her cheek pressed against his warm shoulder as he lifted her. His steps were steady as he carried her through the forest, the scent of pine and sweat mingling in the air. "Why were you out here chopping wood anyway?" she asked, her voice soft against his ear. James was quiet for a moment, his ears reddening. "I need money," he admitted. "Dad's funeral cleaned me out. I want to go back to school and take the college entrance exam. Be someone your dad would approve of." Emily's heart ached at his words. Her father, a prosperous farmer, had declared she'd marry a college graduate, a standard that had shaped her past life's marriage to David. James had heard those words, and they'd driven him to push harder even after years of hardship. She said, "You're already someone I'm proud of," tightening her arms around him. "You always have been." James chuckled, a low, bashful sound. "You say that now, but I've got plans, Emily, big ones. I want to study science and work with the stars, and I want to be good enough for you." The confession, quiet but raw, sent a thrill through her. In her past life, James had achieved those dreams, becoming a renowned scientist, despite the accident that crippled him. But he'd done it alone, believing she'd moved on with David. Now she had a chance to change that. "You don't need to prove anything to me," she said, her voice firm. "But if school's what you want, I'll help you, whatever it takes." James glanced back, his eyes searching hers, and for a moment the world seemed to still, the forest, the river, the weight of her past life, all fading under the warmth of his gaze. They reached the Willow Creek Clinic, a small brick building nestled by the riverbank. James carried her inside, calling for the doctor with urgency and care. The waiting room smelled of antiseptic and old wood, its walls lined with faded posters about health and safety. As James set her on a bench, Emily's eyes caught a figure on a treatment bed. David Miller, soaked and pale, his chest bruised from his rescuer's efforts. His gaze met hers, sharp with reproach, as if blaming her for not diving into the river this time. She held his stare momentarily, then looked away, her heart steady. David was no longer her burden. James, oblivious to the tension, knelt beside her, his hands still on her arms. "You're gonna be fine," he said, his voice a quiet promise. Emily nodded, a spark of determination igniting within her. She'd saved James, and with him a piece of herself she'd thought lost forever. The Willow Creek clinic buzzed with quiet activity, the fans' hum mixing with the low murmur of voices. Emily sat on a bench, her ankle propped on a stool, as James Carter fussed over her, insisting on cleaning her scratches. The doctor, a gray-haired man with a clipboard, was busy with another patient, David Miller, who lay on a treatment bed, his wet clothes clinging to his frame, his face pale and bruised. Emily avoided his gaze, focusing instead on James's gentle hands, which dabbed antiseptic on her arms with a care that made her heart ache. The summer of 1975 felt alive around her, the second chance she'd been given pulsing with possibility. But the clinic wasn't just a place of healing, it was a stage for new dramas that echoed her past life, but with a different cast. A young woman burst through the clinic door, her voice sharp with worry. "Doctor, is he okay?" It was Sarah Thompson, a bold local girl with curly hair and a determined set to her jaw. She rushed to David's side, her hands hovering over him, as if unsure whether to touch him. Emily recognized her instantly. Sarah had been one of the girls who'd chased David during his volunteer days, always lingering near him with a smile and a helping hand. In Emily's past life, Sarah had sneered at her after her engagement to David, claiming she'd have been the one to marry him if she'd saved him from the river. Now it seemed Sarah had gotten her chance. The doctor glanced up, his expression stern. "He's fine, just bruised." Whoever pulled him out of the river went a bit overboard with the chest compressions. Sarah's cheeks flushed, but she didn't back down. "I was panicking, okay? He was limp as a rag doll when I dragged him out. I had to get the water out of him." The doctor shook his head. "You don't need to beat the man to do that." Emily couldn't help it. She laughed, a sharp, surprised sound that drew Sarah's glare. "What's so funny?" Sarah snapped, her eyes narrowing. Emily, still chuckling, raised her hands. "Next time go easy on him, Sarah. You nearly smashed his ribs in." Sarah's glare softened into a grudging smirk, but her attention quickly returned to David. "I saved your life," she said, her voice loud enough for the room to hear. "You owe me." David, sitting up now, winced as he touched his bruised chest, his expression grim. He didn't respond, but his silence spoke volumes. He was trapped just as Emily had been in her past life. Sarah, undeterred, leaned closer, her tone softening. "I'm not letting you off easy, David Miller. You're going to make this right." The implication was clear. She expected marriage, or at least commitment to repay her for saving him. Emily watched, a mix of amusement and irony swirling within her. In her past life, she'd been bound to David by gossip, after saving him, forced into a marriage that drained her soul. Now Sarah was stepping into that role, spreading rumors of her own to tie David to her. The townsfolk outside the clinic were already whispering, their voices carrying through the open window. Sarah pulled him out of the river. Touched him and everything. She's got her sights set on him. Emily felt no pity for David. His earlier reproachful glance confirmed his resentment even in this new timeline. But she felt a strange kinship with Sarah, who was chasing a man who would never truly love her. James, focused on Emily's injuries, seemed oblivious to the drama unfolding across the room. "Doctor, can you check her ankle now?" he called, his voice steady but insistent. The doctor nodded, finishing with David and gesturing for Emily to move to the treatment table. James scooped her up, his arms strong and sure, and carried her across the room. As he did, Emily felt David's gaze on her again, sharp and accusing. She met his eyes this time, her expression calm. She'd have shrunk under that look in her past life, guilt weighing her down. But now she owed him nothing. She'd chosen James, and that choice felt like freedom. Sarah, noticing David's attention on Emily, bristled. "What's your problem?" she snapped at him, her hands on her hips. "You're lucky I was there to save you. Don't go staring at other girls now." David's face darkened, but he said nothing, his jaw tight as he stood clutching his chest. Sarah grabbed the doctor's prescription and followed him out, her voice trailing David. "Wait up, we're not done talking." Emily watched them go, a wry smile tugging at her lips. Sarah's pursuit was relentless, but it was no longer Emily's story to bear. James set her on the treatment table, his hands lingering on her arms. "You sure you're okay?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. Emily nodded, her heart full. She said, "I'm better than I've ever been," meaning every word. The clinic's antiseptic smell, the fan's hum, and the distant rush of the Willow River faded under the warmth of James's presence. She'd saved him not just from the tree, but from the loneliness that had defined their past lives. As the doctor examined her ankle, Emily's resolve hardened. This time, she'd build a life with James, no matter what the town or her family thought. The summer air in Willow Creek hung heavy with the scent of freshly cut grass and river water, a deceptive calm over the small Oregon town. Emily Miller sat in her family's farmhouse, her ankle bandaged from the clinic visit, her heart still racing from saving James Carter in the forest. The memory of James's gentle hands and his shy confession about wanting to be worthy of her warmed her despite the chaos brewing in the town. But that warmth was short-lived. Whispers had spread like wildfire since Sarah Thompson pulled David Miller from the Willow River, her bold claims of obligation fueling gossip that mirrored Emily's past life. As Emily sipped tea at the kitchen table, the front door creak announced an unexpected visitor. David himself, dressed in a neatly pressed shirt, his hair combed with care, his face a mask of calculated charm. Emily's father, Henry, a burly farmer whose prosperity gave him sway in Willow Creek, stood in the main room, his arms crossed as David entered. Her mother, Margaret, hovered nearby, her eyes wary. David's presence was a shock. Emily had avoided him since choosing not to save him from the river, letting Sarah take her place. But here he was, his smile practiced, his posture humble. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson," he began, his voice smooth. "I've come to speak about Emily." Emily's stomach twisted, her tea forgotten. She stood in the kitchen doorway, her hands clenched, sensing a trap in his measured words. "Emily's a fine young woman," David continued, his eyes flicking to her briefly before returning to Henry. "I've only had a few encounters with her, but she deeply takes me. I know you want her to marry a college man, and I'd like to recommend myself." He straightened his chest, puffing slightly proud of his acceptance to a prestigious northern university. To him it was a golden ticket, a guarantee that Henry would see him as a prize for his daughter. But Emily saw through the act. David had proposed under similar pressure in her past life, using gossip to bind her to him, all while longing for Laura Bennett. This time she suspected a deeper motive. Henry's brow furrowed, his skepticism clear. The town was abuzz with rumors about David and Sarah, how she'd saved him, how she was now demanding he take responsibility. "What's this about you and Sarah Thompson?" Henry asked, his voice gruff. "The whole town's talking about how she pulled you from the river. Sounds like you've got obligations there." David's smile faltered, but he recovered quickly. "Just a misunderstanding," he said, his tone pleading. "Sarah's making a fuss, but I swear there's nothing between us. I'd be grateful if you could speak to her father and maybe clear things up." Emily's eyes narrowed. She saw it now. David planned to leverage her family's influence to silence Sarah's claims. Henry, a respected figure in Willow Creek, could quell the gossip with a word, freeing David from Sarah's grasp. But why propose to Emily? Her mind raced, piecing together fragments from her past life. David's family had been destitute, his mother bedridden, his house crumbling. He'd needed someone to support him through college, to care for his mother, and Emily's family, with their prosperous farm, had been the perfect target. He was repeating the same scheme, using her to escape Sarah and secure a future of ease. Before Henry could respond, the door burst open and Laura Bennett stormed in, her gentle face twisted with hurt. "David, if you're proposing to Emily, what about me?" she demanded, her voice trembling. Her eyes shimmered with tears, her hands clenched at her sides. Emily's heart sank. Laura, the woman David had loved in her past life, was caught in his web again. David's face paled, panic flashing in his eyes. "Laura, what are you doing here?" he stammered, his earlier charm crumbling. Laura's voice broke as she spoke. "What about the nights we read poetry by the river? The dreams we shared? Were they nothing?" The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging heavy. Emily saw the truth. David had strung Laura along, never committing, keeping her as a romantic ideal while pursuing practical gain. He'd blamed Emily for their separation in her past life, but now Laura revealed he'd never given her a clear promise. Henry's face darkened, his patience wearing thin. "Sounds like you've got a lot of explaining to do, boy," he growled. David, desperate, shoved Laura back, his voice rising. "There's nothing between us. She's been chasing me, that's all." Laura staggered, her eyes wide with shock. Emily instinctively caught her arm, steadying her. "You okay?" she whispered, meeting Laura's tearful gaze. Laura nodded, then turned and fled, her sobs echoing as she ran from the house. David straightened his shirt to regain his composure, but the damage was done. Henry's expression was thunderous. "Get out!" he barked. "You think my house is a circus? Out now!" David's face drained of color, his plan unraveling. Emily watched him go, her heart pounding with relief and fury. She'd seen his true face. This time, she wouldn't let him trap her. The Willow Creek market bustled with summer life townsfolk weaving through stalls piled with fresh corn apples and handmade quilts. Emily walked home a basket of groceries swinging from her arm, her mind on James Carter. He'd left for town to resume high school, her savings tucked in his pocket to cover tuition. Still skeptical of James's lack of education, her parents had softened slightly after meeting his poised sister, a lawyer who'd vouched for his potential. Emily's heart was light with hope she'd saved James from the accident, and now he was chasing his dreams with her by his side. But as she turned down a quiet alley, a pair of hands grabbed her from behind, one clamping over her mouth, the other pinning her arm. Her basket fell apples rolling across the dirt as she was dragged into a shadowed corner. Emily struggled, her heart racing, until she broke free and spun around. David Miller stood before her, his face bruised from a recent beating, a bandage wrapped around his head. His eyes burned with a mix of rage and desperation, a look Emily recognized from her past life, but sharper now, laced with something unnatural. "Why didn't you save me that day?" he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "If you'd jumped into the river, nothing would have happened." Emily's breath caught her mind reeling. His words weren't just angry, they carried a weight, a knowledge that didn't belong in 1975. She saw it in his eyes, the same cold arrogance from the gala decades later. "You've come back too," she said, her voice steady despite her fear. David's pupils trembled, his face twisting with realization. "You know," he said, stepping closer, "you're like me, Emily. We both got a second chance." He admitted he'd died in a fire at the gala, trapped in a bathroom stall as smoke choked him. The same mysterious force that had sent Emily back, Rado, your choice, had also given him a new life. However, where Emily had chosen to save James, David repeated his old schemes, targeting her family's wealth to escape Sarah's claims and secure his future. "You were always the easy mark," he sneered. "Your family's money, your willingness to slave for me, it was perfect. I played the victim, let the gossip force you to marry me, and you never saw through it." Emily's blood boiled, her hands clenching into fists. In her past life, David had used the river incident to manipulate her, spreading rumors, to pressure her parents, all while stringing Laura along to keep her guilt-ridden. He'd lived off her labor, rising to professor while she withered. "You're disgusting," she spat, swinging her hand to slap him. The crack echoed in the alley, David's head snapping to the side, blood trickling from his lip. "You think you can fool me again?" she said, her voice sharp. "I owe you nothing." David's eyes blazed with fury, his composure shattered. "You'll regret this," he growled, lunging at her. He pinned her against the wall, his hands tearing at her dress, his voice crazed. "You'll be mine, Emily. I'll finish college and become a professor just like before. Your parents will have no choice." Emily screamed, thrashing against him, her nails digging into his arm. She bit his hand hard, and he staggered back, cursing. Before he could recover, a figure charged from the alley's mouth, James Carter, his face contorted with rage. He grabbed David's collar and flung him to the ground, his fist raised. "Please, stay away from her!" James shouted, his voice a roar. David scrambled to his feet, grabbed a stick from the ground and swung it at James. Emily cried, "Watch out!" James caught the stick mid-swing, his strength honed by years of labor overpowering David's frail frame. With a swift kick, he sent David sprawling, the stick clattering away. David groaned, unable to rise, his face a mask of pain and humiliation. Emily, seizing the moment, threw herself to the ground, wailing loudly. "Help! David tried to assault me!" Her cries drew a crowd, market-goers, shopkeepers, neighbors pointing and whispering as they surrounded David. The townsfolk's murmurs grew angry, their eyes narrowing at David's bruised, pathetic form. "He attacked her," a woman shouted. "Get the sheriff," David's face twisted with shame, his eyes rolling back as he shuddered and fainted, overwhelmed by the public disgrace. James rushed to Emily, his hands gentle as he helped her up. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice thick with worry. Emily nodded, tears streaming down her face, not from fear, but from the power of her defiance. She'd exposed David and turned his manipulation against him, and the town would never see him the same way again. As James held her, the crowd's whispers faded, and Emily felt a fierce resolve. David's true colors were laid bare. This time she'd make sure he paid for his schemes. The late summer sun cast a golden glow over Willow Creek, its light filtering through the farmhouse windows where Emily Miller sat, her ankle now healed from the forest rescue. The small Oregon town hummed with its usual rhythm, farmers hauling produce to market, children chasing each other through dusty streets. But for Emily, the world felt new, vibrant, with the promise of the second chance she'd been given. James Carter, the man she'd saved from a falling tree, had left for town to resume high school, her savings tucked into his pocket to cover tuition. Their last conversation lingered in her mind, his shy promise to take the college entrance exam to become someone her father would approve of. Emily's heart swelled with pride, but a quiet ache lingered for the family she'd lost in this new timeline, her son Michael and grandson Ethan, who no longer existed, their absence a bittersweet price for her freedom from David's betrayal. Emily's parents, Henry and Margaret, remained skeptical of James. He's got no education, no family. Henry had grumbled, his arms crossed as they sat in the kitchen. You deserve better, Emily. But their resolve wavered when James's sister Rachel arrived from Portland. A poised lawyer with sharp eyes and a commanding presence, Rachel spoke of James's potential, his brilliance despite years of hardship. He taught himself algebra while working odd jobs, she said, her voice firm. Give him a chance, and he'll outshine anyone in this town. Henry, impressed by her city polish, coughed awkwardly. If he gets into college, I'll consider him, he conceded. Emily hid a smile, knowing James would not disappoint. James threw himself into his studies, renting a small room above a Willow Creek bookstore where he pored over textbooks late into the night. Emily visited when she could, sneaking away from her parents' watchful eyes, bringing him homemade bread and encouragement. You're working too hard, she'd tease, watching him scribble equations by lamplight. James would grin, his eyes tired but bright. Gotta keep up with you, Emily. You saved my life, I owe you a future worth something. Their conversations grew deeper, their childhood bond rekindling into something more substantial. They spoke of dreams, his to study the stars, hers to live a life unbound by regret. Each visit strengthened Emily's resolve to support him, even as her parents locked the door to keep her from sneaking out. Meanwhile, the town buzzed with the aftermath of David's disgrace. Emily's public accusation of his assault in the alley had spread like wildfire, tarnishing his once golden reputation. The university revoked his admission, citing character concerns after her formal complaint reached the admissions board. Emily saw his reaction standing outside his family's rundown cottage as the news arrived. David's face crumpled, his eyes red with fury and despair, as if lightning had struck him. Sarah Thompson, who'd claimed him as her own, stood nearby, her arms crossed, her voice sharp. You're nothing without that college letter, David. You'd better figure out how to fix this. Emily turned away, her heart light with justice. She'd exposed David's true nature, ensuring he couldn't manipulate another woman as he had her. But her thoughts were interrupted by a familiar figure by the river, Laura Bennett, sitting alone, her shoulders slumped. Emily approached, her steps soft on the grass. Laura, you okay? She asked. Laura's eyes, red from crying, met hers. I thought David was different, she said, her voice breaking, pure, untouchable. But after he denied me, groveled to your father, I saw the truth. He's not worth my tears. Emily sat beside her, listening as Laura poured out her heart. She'd loved David and waited for him to commit, but his betrayal, choosing Emily's family for gain, had shattered her illusions. I'm leaving Willow Creek, Laura said, her voice firm. But Emily, watch out for him. He's not done scheming. Emily nodded, her resolve hardening. I won't let him near me again, she said. Laura gave a small smile, then stood brushing off her dress. She said, you're stronger than I was, before walking away, her figure fading into the dusk. Emily watched her go, a sense of closure settling over her. Laura's warning echoed her past life, where David's manipulation cost her everything. This time she'd stay vigilant, protecting the life she was building with James. James's dedication bore fruit. By the following summer, he had aced the college entrance exam, earning a scholarship to a prestigious university in Seattle. When he returned to Willow Creek to tell Emily, his face glowed with pride. I did it, he said, holding up the acceptance letter. And I'm doing it for us. Emily threw her arms around him, tears of joy spilling down her cheeks. Her parents, witnessing his triumph, finally relented their skepticism, giving way to grudging respect. Emily's new life was taking shape, and though the absence of Michael and Ethan stung, she knew she'd traded a painful past for a hopeful future. The years passed like seasons in Willow Creek, each marking a step in Emily Miller's new life. The small Oregon town remained a backdrop of rolling hills and whispering rivers, but it was no longer a place of regret for Emily. She stood now in a grand auditorium in Seattle, her heart swelling as James Carter stepped onto the stage, his suit crisp, his eyes bright with achievement. He'd just been awarded a global prize for his groundbreaking work in astrophysics, a testament to the dreams he'd shared with her in their youth. Emily, now in her 40s, stood with their daughter Lily, a bright-eyed girl of 10, clutching her hand in the audience. The applause thundered, but Emily focused on James, the man she'd saved, who'd become her everything. Their journey hadn't been easy. James's college years were a grind, late nights studying part-time jobs to supplement his scholarship, and the weight of proving himself to a world that had once overlooked him. Emily had been his rock, moving to Seattle to be near him and working as a seamstress to support them both. She'd write him letters of encouragement, slip them into his textbooks, and cook his favorite stew when he came home exhausted. Her parents, Henry and Margaret, had softened over time, visiting their small apartment and marveling at James's growing reputation. Henry had admitted, "You picked a good one," his gruff voice tinged with pride. Emily had smiled, knowing she'd chosen more than a man, she'd chosen a life. David Miller's fate, meanwhile, was a stark contrast. Forced to marry Sarah Thompson under the pressure of her father's threats and the town's gossip, David's life unraveled. He retook the college entrance exam, but his scores were dismal, his confidence shattered by his tarnished reputation. Through Willow Creek's grapevine, Emily heard that he'd spiraled into obsession, wandering the streets, muttering that he was a professor, a graduate student destined for greatness. The townsfolk pitied him, their whispers turning from awe to scorn. Sarah, fed up with his delusions, divorced him, leaving him alone in his crumbling cottage. Emily felt no sympathy. David had reaped what he'd sown, his schemes exposed in this new timeline. In her past life, Emily's son Michael and grandson Ethan had betrayed her, choosing Laura Bennett over their family. They didn't exist in this timeline, a loss that had once stung but now felt like a necessary sacrifice. Emily had Lily, her daughter, with James, whose laughter filled their home, whose curiosity mirrored her father's. She'd traded a family that scorned her for one that cherished her, and though the ache of Michael and Ethan lingered, it was softened by the love she'd found. Laura, too, had found peace. Before leaving Willow Creek, she'd written Emily a letter thanking her for opening her eyes to David's true nature. "I'm starting over in Portland," she'd written. "You gave me the strength to let go." Emily kept the letter in a drawer, a reminder that she'd helped another woman escape David's shadow. As James took the podium, the auditorium hushed. He spoke of his work mapping distant galaxies, unlocking the universe's secrets, but his final words were for Emily. "The person I'm most grateful for is my wife, Emily," he said, his voice steady as the cameras turned to her. "She saved me not just from a falling tree, but from a life without purpose. She stood by me, believed in me, and gave me this path. Emily, I love you with all my heart in this life and the next." The crowd erupted in applause, but Emily's world narrowed to James's gaze, his words wrapping around her like a warm embrace. Tears streamed down her face, not of sorrow, but of fulfillment, a deep, unshakable joy she'd never known in her past life. Lily squeezed her hand, whispering, "Dad's the best, isn't he?" Emily nodded, smiling through her tears. "He is, sweetheart, and so are you." As they stood to applaud, Emily glanced at the stage where James held his award, his eyes locked on hers. The mysterious voice that had given her the second chance, "Redo your choice," echoed faintly in her memory, a gift she'd used to rewrite her story. David's downfall. Laura's freedom, James's triumph, all were threads in a tapestry she'd woven with courage and love. Emily stepped forward with Lily, her heart full, knowing she'd built a life worth living and